You ever meet someone so deeply tuned into emotion, so present that just being around them makes you feel exposed? That's a super empath. They feel deeply, they love deeply, but they're not naive. Now picture this. They get involved with an emotionally avoidant person, someone who runs from depth, who shuts down when intimacy knocks on the door. At first, the avoidant thinks they have the upper hand. They're cool, mysterious, hard to get, but slowly, subtly, the dynamic shifts. The empath, in their quiet, grounded strength, begins to challenge everything the avoidant uses to protect their ego. Let me tell you the 5 subtle signs a super empath is silently dismantling that avoidant's sense of control without ever raising their voice. When an empath decides to stop chasing, it doesn't come with fireworks. It's quiet, subtle, but its impact is seismic. You see, avoidants are used to a certain pattern. They pull away, the other person reaches in. They create distance, and the partner tries to close the gap. This dynamic gives the avoidant a false sense of power. It reinforces their belief that they are in control of the emotional pace of the relationship. But a super empath, someone deeply in tune with emotional patterns, eventually begins to see through this dance. At first, they might still reach out, still try to understand, still believe they can soothe the fear behind the avoidance withdrawal. But slowly the realization sets in that no amount of reassurance can fill a hole someone refuses to acknowledge, that love cannot flourish in one-sided pursuit. And this empath, in their quiet wisdom, begins to withdraw, not as a tactic, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. They stop over-explaining themselves. They stop texting first. They stop asking, "Are we okay?" They start honoring the silence instead of filling it. The absence of their pursuit isn't dramatic, it's just steady. And that's what unnerves the avoidant the most, because the empath was the constant, the one who felt safe, the one who made them feel seen without demanding to be seen in return. And suddenly that presence is gone. This withdrawal is not abandonment, it's a reclamation of energy. The empath is no longer running after breadcrumbs. They've remembered their own worth. And that realization breaks the rhythm the avoidant relied on to maintain distance without ever having to feel the loss. Now the avoidant feels it deeply. The ego, which was so certain it had control, starts to crumble. Questions arise. Why aren't they chasing anymore? Did I lose them? Did I ever really have them? That vacuum left by the empath's absence becomes louder than any words. It forces the avoidant to sit with what they tried to avoid all along: vulnerability, responsibility, and the fear of true intimacy. The empath's detachment is not performative. It's evolved. It says, without saying, "I see what's happening here and I won't participate anymore." It's not about games. It's about peace. And for someone who's built walls to protect their ego, the quiet withdrawal of someone who genuinely loved them is more confronting than any argument could ever be. When a super empath mirrors back emotional gaps, they do it without accusation or drama. Their strength lies in observation and presence. They don't shout, "You're distant," or demand, "Why don't you open up?" Instead, they become a reflection of what they're receiving. If the avoidant partner starts to withdraw, the empath stops overreaching. If communication becomes inconsistent, the empath mirrors that same energy, not to punish, but to reflect the reality of the connection. And in doing so, they hold up a mirror the avoidant was never prepared to face. Avoidants thrive in emotional imbalance. They rely on their partner to keep the closeness alive while they regulate the distance. But when an empath stops filling in the emotional gaps, the imbalance collapses. The avoidant expects the empath to chase, to comfort, to overpunction. But instead, the empath responds with quiet neutrality. This throws off the avoidant's sense of control because suddenly the power dynamic has shifted. What unnerves the avoidant most is that the empath doesn't demand change. They don't issue ultimatums. They simply stop doing the emotional labor. And that subtle withdrawal is more powerful than any confrontation. It forces the avoidant to feel the emptiness they've been avoiding, because now it's no longer masked by the empath's warmth. The mirror effect isn't about imitation. It's about clarity. It allows the avoidant to see the exact impact of their detachment, but in real time. No explanations, no overanalysis, just space, matched for space. Silence met with silence. The emotional reciprocity they've avoided is now staring back at them, and it's disarming. An avoidant might start to feel irritated or confused. They've changed, they're being cold. But what they're really noticing is that the emotional safety net has been removed. The empath is no longer buffering their fear of intimacy. They're simply responding with truth, non-reactive, grounded, and honest. For someone used to emotional control, this shift creates discomfort, because when an empath mirrors your gaps, you're no longer being managed. You're being seen. And that visibility, without pressure or persuasion, can be far more confronting than someone begging you to open up. The empath doesn't try to fix it anymore. They simply let the relationship reflect what it actually is, not what it was pretending to be. In that mirror, the avoidant begins to recognize not only what they've been avoiding, but what they might lose if they stay emotionally unavailable. And for the first time, the cost becomes real. A super empath has a natural gift for holding space. They're the kind of person who will sit with your silence without needing to fill it, who listens to what you don't say just as much as what you do. In the early stages of being with an avoidant, they're often the emotional anchor, patient, understanding, always reaching across the distance to build connection. They don't rush vulnerability, they don't demand closeness, and they don't take emotional shutdowns personally. They know that wounds take time, so they wait. They hope. They continue to offer a safe, open presence. But even the most understanding person has limits. What makes a super empath different is that they don't hold space forever. There's a line, and once they recognize that their emotional openness is being met with avoidance, resistance, or manipulation, something changes. They don't make a dramatic exit or issue emotional threats. They shift. Calmly, quietly, and with full clarity, they begin to draw a boundary not in words, but in energy. Where they once asked, "Are you okay?" they now say nothing. Where they once initiated difficult conversations, they wait to see if the avoidant steps forward. And when the silence stretches out, the empath doesn't rush to close it. They sit in it too, this time for themselves. They begin to honor their emotional bandwidth. They recognize that holding space for someone who won't meet them halfway isn't compassion, it's self-abandonment. When an empath who has consistently shown grace and patience finally says, "This isn't working for me anymore," it hits differently. They're not lashing out. They're not seeking to wound. They're stating a truth that they've taken time to arrive at through reflection, through disappointment, through quiet hurt. And that kind of boundary doesn't spark argument. It creates a vacuum, because now the avoidant is left without the emotional cushion they've grown used to. The empath, once a constant presence, is no longer available for emotional outsourcing. The avoidant may feel caught off guard. They were never pushed, never cornered. They had space, more than enough of it. But the absence of confrontation doesn't mean the empath didn't notice. It means they were waiting to see if the avoidant would choose to grow. When it becomes clear they won't, the empath chooses themselves instead. That choice isn't about giving up. It's about no longer waiting for someone to meet them in a space they've been standing in alone. That calm, grounded decision is what shakes the avoidant most, because it's not made in anger, it's made in strength. A super empath is naturally wired to understand pain that isn't theirs. They often feel it anyway. They're the first to ask what's wrong, the first to empathize with coldness, to see withdrawal as fear rather than rejection. And for a time, this makes them incredibly patient with an avoidant partner. They absorb moods. They internalize blame. When something goes wrong in the relationship, the empath is likely to ask, "What did I do?" even when the answer has nothing to do with them. This ability to take on emotional responsibility gives the avoidant an easy out, one they often take without realizing the damage they're doing. Avoidants, by nature, struggle to sit in emotional discomfort. So when tension builds, they deflect, they minimize, they imply that the other person is being too sensitive, too demanding, too much. At first, the empath may accept that. They doubt themselves, try to shrink their needs, try harder to be easier to love. But over time, the pattern becomes undeniable. No matter how gentle they are, no matter how considerate or calm, the blame always lands in their lap. And now the person slowly and carefully removes to be more and more calm. The blame always lands in their lap. And one day, something clicks. The super empath begins to understand the cycle. The avoidant withdraws, the empath feels confused or hurt, and instead of support, they're met with deflection or silence. And in that moment of clarity, the empath makes a quiet but powerful decision. They stop absorbing blame that doesn't belong to them. It doesn't come with confrontation. It doesn't need to. It shows up in their posture, in their silence, in the way they respond to emotional shutdowns without chasing or justifying anymore. When the avoidant says, "You're overreacting," the empath no longer argues. They just mentally check out. When the avoidant dodges a conversation with sarcasm or avoidance, the empath doesn't try to pull them back. They simply recognize, "This isn't mine to fix." This change unsettles the avoidant because the emotional dynamic has shifted. Where once they could redirect accountability, now there's no reaction. The empath's energy is no longer available for buffering discomfort. They aren't offering explanations or second chances. They've stopped translating mistreatment into something they must endure. For the avoidant, this is disorienting. The person who once softened every edge is no longer cushioning the blows. The person who once bent over backward to understand them is no longer interested in justifying disrespect. In letting go of the blame, the empath forces the avoidant to face something they've spent their whole life avoiding: themselves. There comes a moment when a super empath chooses themselves. And when it happens, it doesn't look angry or loud. It's not a dramatic exit or a tearful plea. It's a quiet, grounded decision made after countless internal conversations, after giving chance after chance, after hoping that love alone would be enough to awaken reciprocity. But it never is. And the empath, who once believed they could hold the emotional weight for two, finally sets it down. Avoidants are used to being chosen by people who will stay, even when they're emotionally unavailable. They often take this loyalty for granted, assuming the empath will always be there, always waiting, always understanding. But what they don't anticipate is that the very same depth of feeling that makes an empath so open-hearted is also what gives them the clarity to walk away when they realize their own needs aren't being met. They don't leave to prove a point. They leave because staying any longer would mean abandoning themselves. When a super empath chooses themselves, it's not in reaction to one moment. It's the result of many moments stacked on top of each other. Moments of being unheard, unseen, dismissed, minimized. Each time the avoidant shut down or pulled away, the empath stayed, hoping that love could coax openness. But eventually, the empath realizes they're not in a relationship, they're in an emotional holding pattern. And that awareness is liberating. The avoidant may be shocked when it happens. They may say, "But I never asked you to leave," or "Why now?" And the answer lives in everything the empath no longer says. There's no blame, no guilt, no explanation owed, because the truth is simple. Someone who is constantly choosing others at their own expense will one day wake up and realize they're empty. And when they do, the only healthy choice is to stop trying to earn love from someone who fears giving it. This moment is often when the avoidant feels the loss the most. Not because the empath finally exploded or demanded something different, but because they simply left with grace. The absence is louder than any argument could be. For the first time, the avoidant sees that the person who always stayed, who always reached out, who always understood, is gone. Not because they stopped caring, but because they started caring about themselves. And that shift, the prioritization of self-respect over emotional chasing, can be the single most ego-shattering moment an avoidant ever experiences. So here's the truth. When a super empath walks into the life of an avoidant, it's not just a relationship. It's a mirror, a confrontation, a quiet undoing of everything the avoidant has built to protect themselves from vulnerability. Not through force, not through demand, but through presence, patience, and eventually through boundaries that speak louder than words. A super empath never sets out to destroy an avoidant's ego. That's not their nature, but their self-awareness, their emotional clarity, and their refusal to abandon themselves any longer is what ultimately dismantles the illusion of control the avoidant depends on. And here's the irony. The very traits the avoidant resisted, depth, honesty, vulnerability, are the ones they find themselves missing when the empath finally walks away. That silence, that absence, that is the sound of the lesson they never expected to learn from someone they thought would never leave. To the empaths listening, your softness is not weakness. It's your ability to feel deeply is a strength, but it becomes your power when you learn to choose you just as fiercely as you've chosen others. And to the avoidants who find themselves wondering why they feel the loss so strongly, it's not just about missing someone. It's about realizing they were willing to love you fully, right up until the moment they realized you never planned to do the same. Thank you for being here, for listening, for doing the inner work, whether you saw yourself in the empath or in the avoidant. Growth begins in awareness. And if you're here, you're already taking that first step. Until next time, honor your boundaries, protect your peace, and remember, real connection starts when we stop hiding from ourselves. Thank you and take care.